The research station, an imposing structure that loomed in the void of space, was quiet save for the hum of technology and the occasional hiss of air vents. A far cry from the bustle of intergalactic cities, this place existed for one purpose: knowledge. Today, however, it was the site of a far more controversial experiment. A group of the galaxy's most advanced species had gathered, each eagerly anticipating what they believed would be the ultimate proof of human weakness. Elliot Calloway stood in the center of the sterile laboratory, his chest rising and falling evenly. He wasn't much different from the thousands of humans that lived across Earth. He wasn't a soldier, not a special forces operative, and certainly not a combat expert. Just a regular man. But there was one thing that set him apart: his unshakable resilience. A trait he had tested in the most extreme circumstances, and that had kept him alive in situations that should have killed him. He wasn't arrogant, nor was he overly confident, but he knew his own body, his own limits. He was here today for one reason: curiosity. Curiosity about what these alien species, beings of unimaginable power and intellect, would make of humanity's greatest survival tool: sheer willpower. Professor Zyrex, a towering figure with gleaming insectoid eyes and shimmering green skin, stood at the front of the lab, overseeing the setup. He was an imposing presence, known for his groundbreaking research and ruthless drive for results. His species, the Zolther, had long believed that no creature in the galaxy could endure pain as humans did. Their scientific curiosity, however, had taken a dark turn. Zyrex was determined to prove that humanity's tolerance for suffering was nothing more than a fragile, primitive instinct waiting to collapse. "Are you ready, human?" Zyrex's voice rang out in a deep, resonant tone that made the air vibrate slightly. His alien students, each a different breed of being, gathered around, watching intently, their multiple eyes tracking every movement. Elliot glanced at them, noticing the mix of alien races. Some had translucent skin, some had segmented limbs, others were covered in bioluminescent scales. They all looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. His gaze met theirs, not with defiance, but with quiet determination. "Ready as I'll ever be," Elliot said, his voice steady, betraying none of the nerves that swirled in his chest. Professor Zyrex motioned to the technicians who began the first test. The lights dimmed as a low hum filled the room. Elliot felt his pulse quicken, but his face remained neutral. He was used to discomfort, to feeling the strain on his body and mind. But nothing had prepared him for the instruments of alien science that were about to be unleashed on him. The first trial began with a simple but intense test: temperature extremes. The air temperature in the chamber dropped rapidly, turning the room into an icy environment. Elliot's breath became visible in the air, but he stood firm, his hands clenched into fists, his body instinctively resisting the cold. Zyrex observed intently. "Human bodies are not designed for extremes. This will break you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of knowledge and experience. Elliot's breath became shallow, but he remained standing. His legs were stiff with cold, his teeth began to chatter, but he focused on the sensation, not allowing it to control him. It wasn't the cold that bothered him, it was the loss of control. He had trained his mind to manage pain, to separate his body from his emotions. The cold, the bite of it, was nothing more than another test. Minutes passed. Then the cold intensified. It felt as though his skin were going to crack under the pressure, but Elliot's body refused to break. He had survived worse, much worse. He had endured temperatures colder than this in the freezing northern stretches of Earth's tundras. This was just another moment to conquer. The alien observers, some of whom had never felt cold as humans did, began to shift uncomfortably. Their bodies were alien to human suffering, and they could not fathom enduring what Elliot was going through. A flicker of concern crossed Zyrex's face, but it quickly disappeared under his steely exterior. "Increase the intensity," he ordered. The technicians obeyed, cranking the temperature even lower. Elliot's body shook violently, and his fingers turned white with frostbite, but his eyes remained fixed forward. The cold was becoming unbearable. His teeth were grinding, his body seizing up. The pain wasn't just physical, It was a primal shock to his system. His heart was pounding harder, but he kept his mind focused, pushing through. "You cannot endure this," Zyrex muttered. "No creature can." Elliot's breath became more erratic, but he refused to fall. His mind was his anchor. He had been through much worse and survived it. The alien students, watching this display, began to feel a strange unease in their own minds. They had never seen a species handle pain like this. Some of them began shifting, their discomfort palpable. A few turned to each other, exchanging glances that carried a silent question: how was this human doing it? Suddenly, the temperature returned to normal. The cold relief was like the sudden release of tension in a tight spring, and Elliot collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. His skin burned from the cold's assault, and his legs felt as though they might give out, but he didn't let himself fall fully. He caught himself on one knee, pressing his hand to the floor to steady himself. "Unbelievable," one of the alien students whispered in disbelief. "He's not dead." Zyrex didn't say anything for a moment, but Elliot could see the slight quiver in his antennae. The professor hadn't expected this. For all his belief in alien superiority, the Zolther scientist had underestimated humanity's resolve. Zyrex had expected the human to scream, to plead for mercy, but instead, Elliot had weathered the storm unmoved. "Next test," Zyrex barked. His voice was colder than the room had been, but there was an edge of uncertainty to it now. Without hesitation, the technicians moved to the next station: pressure. The machine designed for the test would apply increasing force on Elliot's body, simulating the pressure of a collapsing atmosphere. Elliot stood shakily but resolutely. His ribs felt sore from the cold, his body bruised from the initial test, but he was far from done. The pressure began to rise. At first, it was manageable, a tightness in his chest that only made him take deeper breaths. But then it intensified, compressing his lungs, making it harder to draw in air. His muscles began to protest, and his vision started to blur, but Elliot held his ground. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his body trembling, but he refused to fall. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. Elliot's breaths came in ragged gasps now, and the alien students began to murmur, unable to look away from the human's defiance. Some of them began to sweat in sympathy, their faces pale. What kind of creature could endure such a relentless assault on its body? The pressure continued to mount, but Elliot's mind stayed sharp, his survival instinct kicking in. He would survive. He would show them. He could handle anything they threw at him. Zyrex studied him, eyes narrowing. No human could withstand this for long, he muttered under his breath, but even he was beginning to sound uncertain. Elliot could hear the faintest tremor in Zyrex's voice, and it gave him the strength to push through just a little longer. He wasn't going to break, not in front of them. He wasn't going to let them think humans were weak. The pressure finally relented. The machine powered down, and Elliot gasped for air, his chest heaving as he stumbled backward, but still, he stayed on his feet. His body felt like it was made of fire and stone, burning, breaking, but unyielding. Zyrex was silent for a long moment, staring at the human, his antennae twitching in visible confusion. The alien students, who had expected to see Elliot crumble under pressure, now looked at him with something new in their eyes. It wasn't pity. It wasn't sympathy. It was fear. They had come here expecting to prove humanity was fragile. They had come to study the limits of human pain. But what they had witnessed instead was something far beyond what they had expected. What they had witnessed was human resolve. And it terrified them. Elliot stood in the center of the cold, sterile room, barely able to breathe as the pressure of the alien machines slowly increased around him. Sweat slicked his forehead, and his chest felt as if it were being crushed, the weight of the test squeezing the air from his lungs. But there was no retreat, no escape. He focused, gritting his teeth, knowing that every second he endured brought him closer to proving something greater than just his own willpower. The voices of the alien students echoed around him, their murmurs of disbelief rising above the low hum of the machinery. Their eyes, each unique and alien in its own way, fixed on him with an intensity that bordered on fascination. But there was no pity in their gaze. No, it was fear, a growing fear that they hadn't anticipated. They thought they were observing an inferior species, but what they were witnessing now was something far beyond their comprehension. The human spirit. Zyrex stood at the observation platform, his mandibles twitching with impatience. His insectoid features reflected a mask of superiority, but beneath it, a hint of uncertainty flickered. Elliot had withstood the first test with astonishing resolve. The temperature trials had been nothing short of brutal, yet the human had barely flinched. Now this pressure was supposed to break him. It was supposed to expose humanity's fragility. But Elliot still stood tall, breathing shallowly, fighting to maintain his composure. "You're holding up better than I anticipated, human," Zyrex muttered, his voice a mixture of begrudging admiration and disbelief. "But this is only the beginning." Elliot's lips curled into a faint, grim smile as the pressure continued to increase. His ribs felt as if they were being squeezed by an unseen hand, and his vision blurred, edges of darkness creeping in. He fought the dizziness, his mind sharp despite the pain. The human body wasn't meant to endure this, not for long. But Elliot wasn't like most people. He had been in situations where his body had been pushed to its limits before. He had learned that when pain arrived, the only way to handle it was to face it head on. "Come on, Elliot," he muttered to himself, each breath feeling like shards of glass in his chest. "You've got this." The pressure mounted again, an invisible force pressing against his chest, the weight increasing until it was nearly unbearable. His knees wobbled beneath him, but he refused to fall. There would be no surrender. Not today. Zyrex was watching, and that was enough to fuel him. But it was more than just Zyrex. It was the alien students, each one of them wondering just how far humans could truly go. One of the students, a creature with smooth, translucent skin and large, bulbous eyes, shifted uncomfortably. "How is he still standing?" It was a whisper, but Elliot heard it, the question hanging in the air like an accusation. The alien's voice trembled, just slightly, but enough for Elliot to notice. It was an admission of doubt, a crack in their perception of his species. The pressure intensified again, pushing him down toward the floor, but Elliot's body refused to yield. His chest heaved with each shallow breath, and his fingers twitched involuntarily, his muscles screaming in protest. But he didn't let it show. He had trained for this. Physical endurance wasn't the only factor in survival. It was the mind, the will to keep fighting, to refuse to be conquered by something so transient as pain. "You're not like them," one of the other alien students, this one covered in bioluminescent scales, whispered in awe. "You're different." Different. The word lingered in the air, strange to Elliot's ears, but there was truth in it. Humanity was different, not because it was stronger physically, but because it endured where others would collapse. He didn't know if it was the will to survive, the thirst for life, or just the simple desire to show that humans were more than what others assumed. All he knew was that he wasn't going to let this alien experiment define him. Not now, not ever. Zyrex watched, his mandibles twitching with growing frustration. "Enough," he said, his voice clipped. "Increase the pressure to maximum." The machine obeyed, and Elliot's chest was hit with an invisible wall of force that almost sent him sprawling. His body trembled, his legs shaking as though they were about to buckle. His heart thundered in his ears, each beat ringing like a drum. He couldn't tell how much longer he could keep going. He felt his body fighting against him, muscles tightening, breath becoming ragged. The edges of his vision blurred more now, spots dancing in his eyes. He could feel his legs giving way, but he held on, focused on the only thing that mattered, survival. And yet there was something about this moment that transcended the pain. The more pressure they applied, the more he refused to break, the clearer it became to him. This wasn't just a test of endurance. It was a statement. A statement that no matter what the universe threw at him, no matter how dire the situation, humanity would never give up. The universe had underestimated him, underestimated humanity. He felt it then, the realization that had been slowly creeping into his consciousness. He was changing their view of humans. Every moment he endured, every second he resisted, He was leaving an impression on them that they could never erase. He wasn't just surviving, he was showing them the strength of human will, the kind that couldn't be measured by any alien metric. Xyrex's frustration was palpable. He hadn't expected this. Humans, he thought, were weak, frail creatures who couldn't withstand the pressure of the universe's trials. But this human, was something different. He was a symbol, not of human physicality, but of the unbreakable drive to endure, to survive, no matter the odds. Humanity is a paradox, Xyrex muttered, his voice barely audible, more to himself than anyone else. You cannot break them, can you? Elliot's breath was shallow now, but the words reached him. He knew what Xyrex was trying to prove, and he knew he was winning. The pressure continued to increase, but it was no longer about the pain. It was about showing them that there was something more at play here. Humanity wasn't a species to be dismissed. It wasn't a species that could be crushed beneath the weight of any force, no matter how immense. It was a species that, when tested, didn't bend. It didn't break. His vision was nearly gone now, a thick black fog settling at the edges of his sight, but he forced his body to hold firm. His fingers dug into the cold floor beneath him, anchoring himself to the ground, refusing to fall. He could feel his body failing him, his mind fraying at the edges, but he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Not now. Not ever. Human, Xyrex said, his voice low, almost soft now. You have exceeded our expectations. The pressure lifted. Just like that, the weight vanished, and Elliot collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. His body felt as if it had been crushed under 1,000 tons of weight, his chest seizing with every breath, but he stayed conscious. He had won. He lay there, sweat-drenched and breathless, feeling the faint tremor of his muscles, but he remained still. He had made his point. And he knew it wasn't just for Xyrex, or the students watching. It was for humanity. For every human who had ever been told they weren't enough. For every person who had ever been pushed to the brink and refused to back down. I'll never break, Elliot whispered to himself, his voice raw but unwavering. The alien students were silent now, and Xyrex stepped back, his expression unreadable. For the first time since the experiment had begun, there was uncertainty in his eyes. The test hadn't gone as planned. Humanity had proven something they had never considered. Sometimes, the greatest strength lies in never giving up. Elliot's mind was a whirlwind of confusion, pain, and overwhelming clarity. The pressure, a crushing force from all sides, had been unbearable. Every breath was a battle, every heartbeat a drumbeat of impending doom. His chest felt as though it were collapsing under the weight of 1,000 tons, but his spirit refused to yield. His body was stretched to its breaking point, but his mind held fast, locked in a singular focus: survive. The thought echoed in his mind like a mantra. The alien students surrounding him stood in hushed silence, their many eyes locked on his every movement. For the first time in the experiment, doubt was creeping into their expressions. Elliot's endurance had surpassed their calculations, shattered their assumptions, and now, they didn't know how to process the human they had been tasked to study. The collective uncertainty hung thick in the air. Enough. Xyrex's voice rang out, commanding the technicians to halt. The pressure relented, and the machine powered down, but the relief was momentary. Elliot felt his body sag under the sudden absence of weight. His knees buckled, and he fell forward, catching himself on the cold floor with shaking hands. His breathing came in ragged gasps as he struggled to get air into his lungs. His body was broken, but his mind remained sharp. You're still alive, Aliare, one of the alien students, whispered, her voice shaking with awe. How are you still alive? Elliot didn't answer immediately. His ribs felt cracked, his throat raw, his head spinning from the crushing force he had just endured. Yet somehow, he remained conscious, stubbornly clinging to his consciousness as if his survival were the only thing that mattered. It wasn't the pressure that had broken him, it was the thought that they might be right. That maybe humans really were fragile, that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't enough. But he had pushed past that. He had fought it, stubbornly defying their expectations. And now, in the silence of the room, the only sound was the raggedness of his breath and the distant hum of the machines. Zyrex stepped forward, his insected features unreadable. "You have exceeded our expectations," he said, his voice lacking its usual confident edge. "We believed your species could not endure what we subjected you to. We were wrong." Elliot slowly pushed himself up, his arms trembling with the effort, but he refused to remain on the floor. He wasn't done yet. He wasn't broken. He looked up at the alien scientist, the creature who had orchestrated this test, this twisted experiment to measure human frailty. "We're not all that fragile," Elliot said, his voice rough but unwavering. "You think you can measure a person's limits by torturing them? You think pain breaks us? It doesn't. Not all of us, anyway." Zyrex paused, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his alien eyes. The professor had studied countless species, each with their own forms of endurance, each with their own breaking points. But this human, this one single human, had withstood everything they threw at him. Something about Elliot's resilience had shattered Zyrex's conviction. And he wasn't sure what to make of it. "The human will is unique," Zyrex muttered, almost to himself. "We had never encountered such a force." Elliot's breath slowed, but the tightness in his chest remained. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going. But for now, the victory was his. He'd shown them what they hadn't expected to see. Aliare took a tentative step forward, her wide, luminous eyes filled with concern. You shouldn't have endured so much," she said softly, the words thick with a mixture of fear and admiration. "You were breaking. Why didn't you stop?" Elliot met her gaze, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. "Because you wanted me to stop," he replied, voice hoarse. "Because you thought I would. And I wasn't going to let you see me break." The silence in the room deepened, and the alien students exchanged uneasy glances. The atmosphere shifted. What had started as a clinical observation had become something more. They had watched a human endure pain beyond what they had imagined, and now, they didn't know what to make of it. It was as if Elliot had transcended their understanding of what it meant to be human. Zyrex stepped back, his mandibles twitching in thought. He had pushed Elliot to his limits, had watched as the human stood against an unrelenting barrage of tests, each one designed to break him. And yet, not only had Elliot endured, but he had done so with an unwavering determination that defied logic, that defied their science. It was impossible. It was terrifying. "This experiment is over," Zyrex finally declared, though his voice lacked the triumph it once carried. "We will need to re-evaluate our approach." Aliare looked at Zyrex, her voice filled with concern. "Professor, we've witnessed something extraordinary. We can't just ignore this." Zyrex turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "Extraordinary?" he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Yes, perhaps. But it is not what we expected. It is not what we wanted to learn. I don't think we learned anything at all," Aliare said, her voice quieter now. "We thought we were measuring human weakness. Instead, we discovered something much deeper. Something more." Elliot, still standing shakily, let the words sink in. He had never thought of himself as extraordinary. He was just a man, doing what he had to do to survive. But here, in front of these alien beings, he had shown them something they couldn't understand. He had made them question everything they knew about humanity. Zyrex turned his gaze back to Elliot, his expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps there is more to your species than we have given you credit for," he said, almost in a whisper. "Perhaps we have misunderstood you." The room fell silent once more. The alien students seemed to shrink back, unsure of how to proceed. They had been tasked with studying human limits, testing them, breaking them down. But in doing so, they had unwittingly uncovered something far more complex than they had ever anticipated. Elliot knew he wasn't invincible. He wasn't immune to pain or suffering. But he understood something that the aliens didn't. Survival wasn't about physical strength. It was about will. It was about the mind, the drive to keep going when everything else said to stop. He had faced the worst they could throw at him, and he had endured because he refused to surrender. He looked around the room at the students, their faces now filled with a strange mixture of awe and fear. "I'm just a human," Elliot said quietly, his voice steady despite his weariness. "But maybe that's what makes me strong. We've been pushed to the brink for so long, we learn to keep standing. To keep fighting." The alien students exchanged glances, each one processing the words, each one understanding, for the first time, the true nature of humanity. Zyrex said nothing, but his eyes lingered on Elliot for a long moment, and Elliot could see the quiet respect beginning to take root. The experiment had been a failure, but in the end, it had revealed something far more important than any data or conclusion: the strength of human resolve. It was something the aliens would never forget. Elliot's body felt like it was made of shattered glass. Every inch of him screamed in agony, but he had no time for weakness, no time to linger on the burning pain that now coursed through his veins. His muscles were raw, his skin battered, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. He had just endured a brutal series of tests, unimaginable trials of pain, pressure, and torment, each one more intense than the last, but he had stood firm, never once breaking. And now, in the aftermath, a strange calm settled over him. Zyrex, the alien professor, stood at the far end of the observation platform, his mandibles twitching in what Elliot could only describe as something akin to uncertainty. The other alien students, most of whom had watched the experiment unfold with cold curiosity, now stood frozen, their wide eyes betraying the fear they hadn't been able to hide before. They weren't watching a human being anymore. They were witnessing something much greater, something they had not anticipated. The finality of their silence weighed heavily on Elliot's shoulders. He could feel their gaze, the mixture of awe, disbelief, and something else that was foreign to him: respect. He pushed himself up, one hand trembling as it pressed against the cold floor to steady himself. His legs threatened to buckle beneath him, but he refused to let them. He wouldn't fall. Not here. Not now. "You're still standing." Aliare, the alien student who had expressed such empathy earlier, whispered, her voice barely audible. She had been the one to question Zyrex's methods, the one who seemed to sense that there was more to this experiment than they'd realized. And now, in the aftermath of the pain, it was clear that she was no longer just a curious observer. She was shaken, just like the rest of them. Elliot met her gaze, his breath shallow but controlled. "Yeah," he said quietly, though his voice rasped from the effort. "I'm still standing." Zyrex shifted, his antennae twitching in a way that Elliot had learned to associate with confusion, but there was also something more. It was admiration, something he hadn't expected to see from the alien professor. Zyrex had believed that humans were weak, fragile creatures, incapable of withstanding the kinds of trials the aliens had faced. But in Elliot, they had seen something far different, a resilience they couldn't explain, a strength that defied all their calculations. You should be broken," Zyrex said, his voice low but tinged with awe. "We pushed you beyond the limits of what any other species could endure, and yet you stand." Elliot's lips curled into a faint, exhausted smile. "You thought pain would be the breaking point? You thought you could measure human strength by testing how much we can hurt?" His breath came in shallow bursts, as he struggled to keep his footing. "It's not pain that makes us strong. It's the refusal to give up when the world tells us to." The words landed in the room like a heavy weight. Zyrex's insected eyes narrowed slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. The alien students who had gathered to witness the experiment exchanged uncertain glances. Some seemed hesitant, others still processing the gravity of what they had just witnessed. Zyrex began, his voice shaking just a little. "You were supposed to break. That was the purpose of the experiment. We wanted to understand the limits of your species." Elliot shook his head, the movements slow but deliberate. "You wanted to understand human limits?" he repeated. "Well, you've seen them. You've seen what happens when a human is pushed beyond their limits." He let out a strained chuckle, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "But the thing is, there's always more. We always have more. That's the human condition. Aliare stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. But why didn't you stop? Why didn't you give up when you were in so much pain? She was searching for understanding, for some kind of reasoning that made sense to her alien mind. Because if I had stopped, Elliot said softly, you would have won. You would have proven that humans are weak. But we're not. We're not weak. We fight. We survive. The silence that followed was thick, the weight of Elliot's words settling heavily in the room. The alien students were no longer just observing, they were questioning, reassessing everything they had believed about humanity. The assumptions they had carried about human frailty were being shattered before their eyes, and with every passing second, Elliot was becoming more than just a test subject. He was a symbol. A living testament to the strength of the human spirit. Xyrex's mandibles twitched, his expression unreadable, but something flickered behind his eyes. It was as though he were recalculating, shifting his perception of what he thought he knew. You humans! You have no regard for your own safety, he muttered, though his voice lacked the usual disdain. You push yourselves beyond what any sane creature would endure. We don't need to be sane. Elliot shot back, though his voice was softer now, almost reflective. We just need to survive. You wanted to know what makes us strong? It's our will to keep going. It's in our blood. The words hit hard. The alien students were no longer looking at him with the same detachment, the cold curiosity that had defined their approach from the beginning. They were looking at him differently now. They were seeing a human not as an object of study but as something more, something that defied their understanding of what it meant to survive. I don't think we can study you the way we thought, Aliare said, her voice carrying a hint of awe. Not anymore. Elliot gave a small nod, though his head spun with the effort. I don't think you ever could, he said simply. Humans aren't something you can measure with tests. We're something you have to experience. And even then, you'll never fully understand what drives us. The alien students stood in stunned silence, and for the first time since the experiment began, there was no sense of superiority in their expressions. They were no longer the ones with the answers. They were no longer the ones with the power. The balance had shifted. The experiment had failed in ways they hadn't anticipated, and in that failure, something far more important had been revealed. Humanity wasn't weak. It was unbreakable. Xyrex stepped forward, his towering figure looming over Elliot, but this time, there was no arrogance in his posture, no sense of superiority. There was only respect. We have misjudged you, he said, his voice quiet, almost reluctant. And for that I apologize. Elliot didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He had said what needed to be said. He had proven what needed to be proven. He had shown them the strength of humanity, not through physical power, but through will, determination, and the refusal to break. Xyrex nodded slowly, as if coming to terms with something he had never expected. Perhaps we have learned something, after all, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. And for the first time, the aliens truly understood. They had come to study human frailty, but in doing so, they had learned about the unyielding strength of the human will. They had witnessed something extraordinary, something that could never be measured by their advanced technology, something that would remain etched in their minds for the rest of their lives. Elliot stood in the quiet aftermath, his body aching and his mind heavy with exhaustion. But deep down, there was a quiet satisfaction that lingered. He had proven his point, not just to the aliens, but to himself as well. The true measure of strength wasn't in how much pain a body could take, it was in the courage to stand, to keep going, no matter the odds. And that was something humanity would never be beaten at.